Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on the planet right now. My name is Shane Barco, and it's my very special privilege to be able to welcome you to our Cannabis Policy and Your Community, What is Best Practice webinar with Q&A. Time won't permit me to actually go into all the details regarding our speakers coming up soon, but I will give you a quick introduction as we proceed forward. So welcome to all our delegates. Acknowledgement of country. I want to start proceedings today with an acknowledgement of country that has become a practice of starting events in Australia, particularly over the past 25 years as Indigenous reconciliation has been developing. This forum is being shared and based in Australia, a nation that was originally inhabited by hundreds of Indigenous tribes, cultures, languages and nations. We acknowledge that they are the original custodians and that they have a special place of connection with this land. I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, to ask that we can find ways to work together to overcome the damage that alcohol and other drugs is causing in all of our communities. I personally am here on Wurundjeri and Bunurong land and is part of the Kulin Nation in what is now known as Victoria. Indigenous people bring an important voice to our deliberations, so we acknowledge them and their place across Australia. Just by way of an agenda for today, so you know what's happening, there's going to be an introduction of Prime, which I'll take you through to set the scene for today before we bring on our four remarkable presenters. And again, as I said previously, we won't go through their bios again, and if we did, we'd spend another half an hour talking about the remarkable and outstanding achievements of each presenter, but you can pursue that when you need to. There will be a Q&A at the end. What we're going to do is have all four presentations in play so that those who can only be here for the hour and a half can listen to all the data that's being presented, all the evidence-based data going to be presented today. And then during each episode that we present, each presenter's session, there is an opportunity for you to ask a question. And there's a mobile number on your screen there, 0491 681 630. At any time, you can text a question to that number with your name, organisation that you're from, if applicable, and the question to which presenter you want to ask the question. We will officially close and give thanks to our presenters at 11:30 a.m, but that's not the end of the proceedings. We'll continue with a live Q&A where all four presenters will be live to answer your questions online and continue beyond that if we need to. So, from a primer perspective, what is the loudest message you hear on cannabis at the moment in your space? What is the loudest message that you are hearing on cannabis in your arena right now? So what's being reported, or more importantly, what is being promoted in the marketplace at the moment? It's an important distinction. We've been here before. This is an interesting piece of literature. The sale of Dr. Poppy's Wonder Elixir started in the late 1800s and sold in Australia until the end of World War II. And you can see it was the panacea of all ills. The cure-all that was in play. So again, it seems we've come full circle in some of the dialogue around this particular substance. An article written for by Missouri Medicine recently, or late last year, was quite an exceptional one. And the question that was asked, two questions that were asked in that particular article by Dr. John Hagan. And the first one was, what do these deadly poisons have in common? Arsenic, radium, mercury, thallium, and cyanide. The answer, he said, is at one time they were all considered by physicians and the public as useful medications and or healthy supplements. They were taken in a wide variety of lotions, potions, tinctures, tonics, and pills. These poisons were recommended, sold, and prescribed freely by physicians. It took thousands of deaths and many decades before the harmful nature of these substances was perceived by physicians and the general public. The second question he asked in the article was this one. What disease-causing carcinogenic substance was once widely used and recommended by physicians for coughs, sore throats, nervousness, and believed by the public to be harmless or salubrious? Well, of course, the answer to that one is no hard guess, is tobacco. More than half of physicians in 1940 smoked cigarettes, and many recommended them to patients. Smoking was considered by the public as socially sophisticated. They believe that doctors and dentists who told them tobacco was good for health. It took millions of deaths and many decades before the harmful nature of nicotine was widely perceived by physicians and the general public. Now, there's all doctors' advices that was in play, but what's not reported, and this is what's quite breathtaking in our current setting, if you were to read, and we say this to all audiences that we engage with, if you were actually to read, personally, 3 academic journal articles every day, so academic, published in peer-reviewed journals every day on the physical, mental, community, environmental harms of cannabis, after 10 years, you still wouldn't have read a third of the literature on the concerns around this particular substance. After 10 years, not even a third you have covered. This is just one such resource that's in play at the moment. It's quite a robust one. It's about 2 kilograms in weight. Talking about the real concerns around this. But in the old adage remains true. They used to say the pen was mightier than the sword, but now we have a 140 character tweet that is mightier than 10,000 evidence-based journal documents. There's a quote by Dr. Paula Gordon. Said, no state can ever successfully regulate the use of marijuana owing to the fact that it has such idiosyncratic and unpredictable effects on users and those exposed to its use. No state can prevent the predictable as well as unpredictable genotoxic, teratogenic, and other effects, including deleterious mental, psychological, physical, and other effects of marijuana use and exposure to marijuana use. Biochemical individuality and indifferences in psychopharmacological effects that marijuana use and exposure to marijuana use has all make regulation an impossibility. Just to underscore that, we're going to show you a short clip from an excerpt taken from a town hall meeting earlier this year in Vermont. And this is a public health advocate. And we're concerned that the public health voice is very, very small in this arena. And that's something we want to redress. I want you to listen to his remarks about what's already in play in the States and the difficulties being encountered in dealing with this issue.
I'll go back. If we want to do data-driven policy, if we want to base this on science, we want to base this on data, I'll just go back to something I said earlier. No state has done this right. No state has done this in a way that has protected consumer safety. I'll point to the E-Valley outbreak. 1 out of 6 of the vaping devices are state-sanctioned devices. So we failed there in every single state. Public safety, impaired driving is an issue. The youth, again, in Vermont and Maine, we're seeing upticks and increases in other states as well. Because it's tied to normalization. Just having the campaign, just having the conversation is normalizing it. I'm not saying it might, it is normalizing it. But that's the whole point of a campaign, right? You want to normalize it because you want the voters to vote the way you want them to vote. So of course it's normalization. And the black market. They had a debate in the legislature yesterday in Maine about some bills. He says, we need to get rid of the black market. You're not going to get rid of the black market. The black market isn't going anywhere. If that is your metric, you're going to fail. So no state has got this right. Every state has said the same things that we've heard tonight, that we're going to do this in a responsible way to protect all these things, but no state has done it because the states don't have the capacity to do it. It might be a good idea on paper. It sounds good, but nobody's been able to do it. The successes have been the industry. Yeah, the industry is making tons of money. They're successful. So that's and more often than not, and this is my experience and what I hear from other public health advocates in states that have legalized, the default of legislatures is to the industry. It's to talk to the industry about how are we going to do this. It's not, the default isn't to go to public health first. In Maine, I occupy the public health seat on our Marijuana Advisory Commission. The first draft of that advisory commission had 0 seats for public health, and it had 3 seats for the industry. We were lucky that the vote was close, statistically 50-50. It gave us just enough political leverage to get that one little seat that I have. And we've had this commission for over a year. We've only met once. States, so I mean, I understand that I think there's good intent and people come from the right place, but nobody has been successful in this. And we need to be honest about it.
It's my very real pleasure to introduce to you our very first presenter who's going to frame some issues for us, Professor Jan Copeland, and her presentation, Cannabis and Mental Health Issues.
Good morning. I'll be providing an overview of cannabis use and associated harms to set the scene for the rest of our panel. Cannabis, unlike other drugs, is not a single entity, but a class of drugs. And this makes it especially complicated to talk about because the different components have different effects, and it does increase the degree of difficulty in communicating messages around cannabis. Just at the broadest level, there are three forms of cannabinoids: the plant-based ones, the phytocannabinoids, the ones that our own body produces. Finally, the group that received a lot of attention a few years ago across the world were the ever-multiplying synthetic cannabinoids. And that's an interesting group, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's kind of an example how identification of harm, spread communication of those harms, and changes in legislation to make those drugs in the landscape of their use and decreased the harms associated with them. There are more than 100 unique phytocannabinoids, cannabis sativa plant, the sativa being the most common plant group. In addition to those cannabinoids, they're known as terpenes and murines, and they're unique flavors and smells associated with the plants, who are strong proponents. So that these provide on ensemble effect. I would be careful. So it's only purified versions of any tobacco. The most common of these phytocannabinoids is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, particularly promising for conditions such as epilepsy. Those pediatric epilepsies is cannabidiol, CBD, which is not in most doses, but it does have some psychoactive effects, and I've seen those in studies that I've conducted. Smoked cannabis exerts its psychoactive effects within minutes, and they peak within 30 minutes, and they last 2 to 5 hours when smoked. When the cannabinoids are taken orally, they take much longer to take effect, and they last for a great deal longer. Here's a graphic to show you the two main cannabinoid receptor systems that we have in our bodies. There are others being discovered, of course, but these main ones, and even then we know very little about them. You can see there in red the CB1 receptors, and they're most abundant in the frontal and cerebral cortex, and the CB2 receptors are most common in the lymphatic and reproductive systems, and so much more to understand about what those interactions might be. You might note there that down at the bottom of the graphic is the brainstem, which is responsible for breathing and cardiac function, for example. And there are no CB1 or 2 receptors in that area. So that explains why with cannabis we don't get those overdose deaths with acute use, because it does not exert effects on breathing and circulation, unlike opioids, for example, or alcohol. The abundance of CB1 receptors in areas that affect learning and memory and executive decision-making explain the kinds of effects that we see with cannabis use. So how is cannabis consumed? Well, at the top there, we have the way which we're almost familiar with, is of the plant being smoked in various forms, either in joints, and it culturally depends whether you use tobacco or not, pipes, water pipes, bongs, which were most common in Australia, or even a hookah, which come back in fashion, if you like, within different communities and different age groups. The hollowed out cigar, the blunt, was really coming from minority culture in the US 20, 30 years ago. But I've certainly heard anecdotally, and looking at the data now, it's becoming more common, particularly amongst young users, where if you know young people who are suddenly smoking very cheap cigars, they're actually smoking cannabis, it's not for the tobacco effect. Vaporizers, the heated plant material development system shown there on the side really came out of the medicinal cannabis market, where it was thought to be a safer way to heat rather than combust the cannabis. It probably is safer, but it's not entirely safe. Other chemicals such as ammonia are released when plant material. The other, which I'll talk a little bit about later, purified oils and waxes, which are US, where medicinal and legal cannabis, recreational cannabis, is being driving increased levels of use. And as the more you use, the more tolerance you develop, and you need more and more potent versions of the product in order to get the same high. The medicinal market also saw the blossoming of the baked goods, the brownies, the cookies, the milk-based drinks, the sodas, the coffees. You can now, in the US, get shots of CBD in Starbucks. Capsules, typically the synthetic, just for completion, I've added it in there, is more of the medicinal products. Dronabinol, for example, which is not available in Australia, is a THC synthetic. And more now, we're seeing topicals in the medicinal markets in the US, the ointments, the creams, and finally the pessaries and suppositories, if you've run out of other places to use your cannabis. Just an example here of the emerging administration methods relevant to adolescent use. Out of the medicinal products are these kind of gummy bear type products, which you can't tell the difference once it's out of the packaging, whether it's a regular gummy bear or quite a potent THC product. In that packet, there's 100 milligrams of THC. Each one of those bears is an adult dose to intoxication of THC. You can see there the vaping THC products, the lollipops, and one there which is a vaporizer, which is disguised as a Ventolin asthma inhaler. So this means young people can use discreetly in schools and other institutions without any smell, or people being aware that they're actually becoming intoxicated at that point. One of the issues which is being driven by increasing availability and law changes is that the potency of the product is changing. This increased potency is associated with an increased incidence of psychosis and other mental health conditions in studies that have actually compared high and low level THC users over time and seen the different rates in psychosis. Potency is a way of describing the percentage of the principal psychoactive, THC, in any particular product. And it's generally higher than ever before, between 15 and 25%. You can see there a graph from the DEA in the US, and you can see from the mid-90s how much the average potency of the plant has changed. In my former centre, we funded a study of cannabis seized in New South Wales as part of the cannabis cautioning scheme. And we tested more than 200 samples and found that on average, a high mean THC content consistent with the US of almost 15% and almost no CBD. We also looked at, there's a myth about bush bud being a much safer product than hydroponic, for example. Well, we didn't find any support at all for that mythology, where we looked at known seizures from indoor and outdoor cultivation sites, and there was no difference in the potency. It's related to the seeds. It's not related to how they're grown. Waxes and oils have extremely high potency, unbelievably more than 90%. It's pretty much pure THC that they can now extract. Daily use leads to very high tolerance to the effects that, when I was in Colorado last year talking to people in the industry, they say that if you're dabbing every day, you just can't get high anymore from that method. And so you have to take edibles, high potency edibles, because they're metabolized in a different way through the liver, and you can then get an additional high. So this is kind of a high chasing, very dependence producing pattern of use that hopefully we'll be doing everything to avoid. Now to stress of here that for the first time we're approval of medicinal cannabis here in Australia, and of course I'm biased in saying it also correlates to the closure of the National Cannabis Centre that I led, and we've particularly specialised in getting messages out to young people and minority populations. We've seen this with cocaine, and as the environment becomes more have been in the increasing levels of use measured 3 years later, and this is very with what was seen in the US. Positive around cannabis, and the lobbyists were working very hard to reduce harm perception and to close down my centre. Perception of cannabis being a problem drug in the years. A significant increase in recent use amongst supported by government, and other drugs over long periods of time. Women are more likely to take up that drug. With 5 to more than 1 in 3 use more often. This is the level where you start to see disorder. Problems throughout the life course. Use decreasing with other drugs. They did not have the cocaine increase, ecstasy increase, and Paul Dillon and I have been doing some subsequent surveys in private schools where we have seen also this in ecstasy use. The point I want to make is a breakdown of age by gender is importance of getting in with targeted prevention strategies to prevention, because after 15, and we see this in survey after adult levels of use. Consequences, however, likely if use is frequent in larger quantities and from an early age, the age of 16. Amongst other factors, we've already increasing potency in retail products in the US, which is very much driven the acceleration of potency. And of course, I know this is just a click away. It's all available online. Australia, that may be a big shock. It happened. Other sort of use, and I've touched on smoking, eating, vaping, the components, the methodology that you can buy in stores or online that has high CBD, that is not supported by the data and bred out of the plant. And it's been absolutely verified by reliable laboratories. People who recent range of adverse results, including increased about double the risk of causing a fatal if you're intoxicated with cannabis. And I know about changing the laws about the per se laws using medicinal, certainly one to watch. Experience of respiratory distress. We've not yet seen the time to catch up with tobacco. Years of let's say, wheezing, bronchitis, etc., are markedly increased. Impairments in learning, memory. For those who educational performance is controlled for, we still see school without educational qualifications amongst that group compared to if you don't have educational qualification, you're not set up for a vocation in life. So that is associated with a significant increase in welfare, dependence, poverty, and also crime. The development of psychosis is something I'll just mention a little bit more about, because it is the most commonly used cannabis-related harm. So, but my summation of the literature with my colleague, cannabis use typically precedes, and it does seem to be making an important contribution. The relationship is clearly not one-to-one, because as cannabis use goes up, we don't see the same kind of direct increase in schizophrenia and psychosis. But to me, that's not the most issue. The important issue is about not using cannabis if you're a high-risk person. Or just to highlight why I say that, when we look at substance-induced psychosis, alcohol is most commonly associated with a drug-induced psychosis. People don't know that, but it's true because so many people use alcohol, and as more people use cannabis, that will drive that data as well. But only 5% of people with an alcohol-induced psychosis will go on to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia in their lifetime. This is compared with 30% of those who have had amphetamine-induced psychosis. And of course, we hear a great deal about amphetamine-associated psychoses. But for those with a cannabis-induced psychosis, almost half of them, particularly males, will go on to develop a full schizophrenia over their lifetime. So a cannabis-induced psychosis should not be brushed aside as a one-off. It is, in fact, a concerning marker for an ongoing psychotic disorder over life. Just to briefly look at the literature, any cannabis use overall increases the risk of developing a psychosis by 2, doubling. Amongst heavy users, double again, almost 4 times as likely. And adolescent use, which is heavy, increases the risk 6-fold of developing a psychosis. One of the other concerning factors is from initiation of regular monthly use to the onset of psychosis is about 6 years. So rather than being on average 21 at their first diagnosis, if they're not cannabis users, it goes down to 18. And we all recall those important things that happened between 18 and 21, finishing schooling, going to university, or choosing some other trade or professional goal, and establishing those lifelong friendships, for example. So missing out on those 3 years, if a psychosis is inevitable, sadly, in your life, avoiding cannabis use can give you 3 more years of developing a really healthy foundation to your life before you become unwell. And beyond causation, it's really what happens if you continue to use cannabis after you've been diagnosed. And study after study shows that it's associated with reduced compliance with therapy and psychiatric medication, leads to more hospitalizations and relapse, particularly associated with the increased level of psychotic dementia symptoms, so hallucinations and delusions, increased family distress, and naturally increased cost to the community as people are not becoming entirely well. Looking at the other common mental health concerns, cannabis users are more likely to experience depression and anxiety than non-users, and those with anxiety and depression are more likely to report using cannabis than those who don't have those disorders. The most recent systemic review of the relationship between adolescent cannabis use and later depression, anxiety, or suicidal thoughts up to the age of 32 found an increased risk of developing major depression, about 7% in young adulthood, and concerningly, suicidality, especially attempts, 3.5 times more likely amongst cannabis users. And at a time where the whole nation, the whole world is going through such a terrible stressor, where we're most concerned about mental health, we see an increase in cannabis use from those surveys that have been done this year. This is really a horrible combination. This translates to more than 400,000 young adult cases of depression that are potentially attributable to cannabis exposure in the US. So that's a pretty concerning kind of data point. Interesting, the same thing was not seen for anxiety. Just the final point on harms I wanted to make, mostly because it's my area of specialty, and it is the most common harm associated with regular use, is cannabis use disorder, more commonly thought of as addiction or dependence. And this is just a graph of the proportion of drug users who have ever used the drug who will go on to become dependent. Tobacco up there is the big one, where 1 in 3 of those who ever use tobacco will go on to develop a dependence on it, followed by heroin and the ones we know, crystal meth and crack cocaine, through to alcohol, 1 in 7 to 8, The non-crystal, so amphetamines, the powders, 1 in 9, and cannabis is 1 in 9 to 1 in 11, typically thought to be about 10%. So we have a significant level of problem in our community. It hasn't been measured for more than 10 years here in Australia, but probably the average percentage of Australians with a cannabis use disorder is about 2%. So about 500,000 people who are dependent on cannabis in our community. And this, of course, is related to cannabis policy as well. We've had decriminalised cannabis in 3 jurisdictions for a very long time. Probably most people don't seem to be aware of that. They're arguing for full legalisation when a decriminalisation is a very, very workable alternative. Also in other jurisdictions, you can see that we have diversion programs for minor offences, but there have been some recent changes. As I said, coinciding with the closure of my centre was the change that medicinal cannabis can be accessed by various schemes, but not registered by the TGA, except Nabiximols, Sativex. It's the only one that's actually provided the level of data that we require of every other drug in our country for it to be registered and made available to the community. But medicinal cannabis, for some reason, as it has not been approved by the FDA in the US as a medicine. CBD in semi-synthetic forms, because I've told you about the problems with plant claiming CBD levels, where there's proven to be less than 2% THC, is now a Schedule 4 drug in Australia, and it can be prescribed by any doctor. And there's now talk that low dose, less than 60 milligrams a day, may be approved for pharmacy over-the-counter access next year. I'm frankly perplexed about why almost a homeopathic dose of THC would be made so widely available without evidence of it having effect at such a low dose. I'm personally familiar with making available 1,200 milligrams in a study of its use in cannabis withdrawal. So I'll be watching that. And last year, the ACT passed a bill allowing for possession and personal use as of January, end of January this year, to prohibit recreational use and also supply. Interestingly, they cannabis users in the ACT will grow their cannabis because seeds aren't allowed. Supply comes is also seem to be that well out, but
to be about monthly. And then a few years later, they said, well, we're now defining chronic use as weekly. Well, where I live in Colorado, and we've had legal cannabis now for adult or recreational use for about 8 years, it really is multiple times a day. It's not just monthly, weekly, daily. Now it's multiple times a day. When you increase potencies, which we've seen across the board with these products, and so you have much greater potency on the product, and then you increase use, you increase greater risk of having these outcomes that we're going to talk about. So keep that in the back of your mind, and I'll circle back to that in a little bit. The first episode of psychosis due to high potency cannabis use has gone up tremendously. Daily use of high potency marijuana increases psychosis risk 5 times. Weekend only use nearly triples the risk. So, we really need to be thinking about, we're not just trying to change laws, we've changed the product. It's not just a little bit of weed like you may have been used to back in your high school days. This is some stuff that has been hybridized, it's been genetically modified, and it's just not the same drug whatsoever. It also increases mood and anxiety disorders with high rates of comorbid mood and anxiety disorders among respondents with marijuana dependence. We know that adults are at risk for marijuana dependence disorder with these higher potency products. So we see, looking at workplace, you could see the extreme numbers here that go up when you have people who already have anxiety disorders, depression, mania, that type of thing. So again, another risk for employers to look out for. We also see an increased risk of stroke amongst those who are even young men. So my graphic kind of came out weird a little bit there, but what it says is 80% of men at an average age of 32, higher rate of stroke within 24 hours following use. That's something that is just practically unheard of when it comes to hiring healthy young men in the workplace. And then with cannabis users, you just see this risk of stroke amongst them. So you're talking about even other greater health issues. And then you have to look at, do you have insurance coverage for those issues? Can they recover? Are they out of work? Do they need, like maybe surgery or lifetime medication? Do they then have to go on disability? And just all the things that go along with that. Cannabis use and risk of prescription opioid use disorder in the United States. You may be hearing that if you will legalize cannabis, then you will solve the opioids crisis. And the fact of the matter is, this is absolutely not true. You can see the conclusion in this study, and there are others that verify and back this up. Cannabis use appears to increase rather than decrease the risk of developing non-medical prescription opioid use and opioid use disorder. We've also seen this happen in the state of Colorado, whereas initially the opioid use dropped slightly, then it increased dramatically after that short decrease. And then we also have seen an increase in deaths related to heroin. In the state of Colorado, when employees were surveyed, 48% said they've gone to work high or stoned or under the influence of this drug in the past 30 days. It's kind of become like a badge of honor. Employees think, haha, it's funny, it's legal here, I can do what I want. And they don't consider safety first. Safety is the priority. I say all the time, drugs and safety do not mix. And whatever your employee chooses to do at home on their own time, they should do that with consideration that when they walk into the workplace, they need to be safe and prepared to work safely. So 48% is a tremendous amount of people who are willing to roll the dice and gamble and show up to work ill-prepared and maybe at risk of injuring themselves or someone else. Then, I just now mentioned what happens when an employee does what they do on their own time in their own home. And as an employer, you may think, well, that's correct. There's nothing that I can really do about that. I want you to consider a study that was done on pilots back in the 80s. And this was in New Zealand. A group of pilots, professional pilots, became proficient on a flight simulator, and they got on the flight simulator, and they could land the plane and do all of the maneuvers on the plane. And then once they had a certain amount of professional proficiency, they were given a cannabis cigarette. They all smoked this joint. It was low-grade THC, significantly compared to today's cannabis. We're assuming it was less than 10% THC comparatively. And then once they smoked the cannabis cigarette, they got back into the flight simulator and flew in time increments, right? So 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45, an hour, etc. And they all crashed their planes. After that segment of the study, they went back to the dorms, they slept, they came back 24 hours later, said, we're feeling good, I'm fine, I don't have any more impairment, let's see how I can fly this airplane. 24 hours after smoking one joint at low-grade THC, the pilots had difficulty in landing on the runway, increased vertical and lateral deviation from the required flight path. Lateral deviation on approach to landing was twice pre-marijuana test. Significant increases in distance from the center of the runway on touchdown. One pilot landed off the runway entirely. And as I mentioned, they stated in interviews that they were not aware of any type of impairment. That is something that is very, very unique to cannabis and needs to be paid attention to in the work community, because we have a tendency to take the user's word for whether or not they are under the influence. But marijuana or cannabis actually impacts the part of the brain that tells you that you've had enough and that you are impaired. So it's a real catch-22, because a lot of times people who use alcohol can say, okay, I've had enough, I shouldn't be driving, or I shouldn't try to do that task or this. But it's not typically the case with cannabis. Users will say, I'm fine, I'm safe, I'm actually better than fine, or it made me more acute or more alert or whatever. And the reality of it is that is not the case. We have to look to the science and not to those who use for the data on those outcomes. In the state of Colorado, 57% of marijuana users admit to driving within 2 hours of use, and you can see our driving data has been horrific since we have legalized this drug. We passed legal medical cannabis in 2001, and then in 2009, we allowed that to be to an unlimited amount of patients per caregiver. And then in 2012, we voted for personal or adult recreational use. Those stores opened up for the first time in 2014. So 2013 personal use was legal, but we didn't have the retail stores for another year. So we had a little bit of a dip from availability of product. And then in 2014, when those retail stores opened up, you can see that our fatalities have gone absolutely through the roof. Really a way that we do not want to go when it comes to safety. 1 in 5 marijuana users in Colorado report driving after using the product. Consider this. What does that have to do with the workplace? The leading cause of death for workplace fatalities, according to the U.S. National Safety Council, is driving while impaired, driving while distracted, and driving while fatigued. You would think that, common sense would say, do not drive under the influence, but that's not quite how it pans out. As I mentioned, the users often think they're safe or safer. So this is a real problem and something that employers need to consider. The National Transportation Safety Board reported a study of truck drivers from 182 heavy truck crashes in which the driver was fatally injured. A third tested positive for illicit drugs. Marijuana and alcohol were found most frequently, right? So you can see the driving issue, it's a big issue. We also need to look at the types of industry where we're having positive drug tests and what that looks like. Employees who are full-time, ages 18 to 64, this is your prime workforce. Accommodations and food services, 20% of those employees fail their drug test for marijuana. Arts and entertainment and recreation is high. Management, information systems and technologies, construction. These tend to be trades in which there is little to no drug testing. And I believe that is part of the reason why we see high numbers in these areas, because we do know that drug testing is a deterrent. And again, I'll circle back to that in a moment. In the meantime, we are seeing that employees who work in the cannabis industry, they are using the product on the job. They're having accidents and injuries. Many of them are coming to work under the influence. And they do, they do a job that involves a lot of manufacturing, and it is an unsafe situation. And then they have a tendency not to have benefits or coverage because their employers kind of keep them off the radar, pay them cash under the table. And so it's just a very difficult working environment that can be unsafe for those who are inside the industry. Again, I said drugs and safety don't mix. Substance use does not equal safe or safer. Substance abusers are 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim in the U.S. Roughly 35% of industrial accidents and injuries that take place in the U.S. involve drugs or alcohol. Substance abusers are 33% less productive on the job, and absenteeism is significantly higher. And we see these numbers increase dramatically with employees who use marijuana. They actually have higher accident and injury rates than their counterparts who choose to use other drugs. And we've had that data for quite a long time. Any position or profession that operates machinery is at risk from someone who's under the influence. Anytime there are reflexes or judgment that are compromised, it's a problem. And note that in the U.S., substance abusers are responsible for 40% of all industrial fatalities. So if you are involved in an industry that is doing a lot of work to maintain safety and keep safety ratings high and prevent accident and injury, but you are not having an ongoing conversation about the drug culture, you are really missing the boat. So just take that into consideration. We just have, in the world of what is going on in this whole realm, here we have a forest preserve truck driver who had a significant amount of THC or marijuana in his blood. He drove the forestry dump truck into a group of cars at a traffic stop at 76 miles per hour, and fatalities occurred. A lot of people will say if you use marijuana, it makes you drive slower, or, that which is safer. But basically all that is that slowed reflexes, and it's not okay. We also see a lot of positives in the food industry. But as you can see by this article, we're seeing usage in transportation workers, even teachers, and even law enforcement, which is sad. Nationally, Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, which is one of the largest drug testing laboratories in the United States, says workforce drug positivity is at an all-time high, the highest rate in decades, finding the analysis of more than 10 million drug test results. What we are seeing is that drug use is significantly higher in 12 years after going down and down and down. It is now not only the greatest increase, but now the increase of all illicit drugs, not just legal cannabis. So we were going down, we legalized cannabis, and then cannabis positivity went up for THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, and now all illicit drug tests have gone on the skyrocket, which is, again, the wrong direction. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, drug and alcohol-related deaths in the workplace soared in 2016 with a spike of more than 30% in a single year. And they also show that fatal work injuries in 2016 were the highest since 2008. So you can clearly see this is not the way that we want to go. For employers, it is not enough. It is absolutely not enough just to not hire, quote, stoners or people that look like they use drugs, because people who use cannabis are in all walks of life, from your professionals to, blue collar, all the way across the board. This is something that, there's mommies who drop their kids off at school and go eat their edibles. This is all over the map. So there's really not a screening tool or method that can protect you unless you are using like a committed drug testing program. Employee drug use costs U.S. employers upwards of $7,000 a month in lost revenue. And this is as a result of lost labor, absenteeism, turnover by unreliable employees or employees who, choose not to show up to work on time. There's a variety, especially, then it comes to accidents and injuries. Also note that there is a huge underlying subculture of people know whether or not the job that you offer is drug friendly, and they talk online. They go to websites like Reddit and they say, does this employer drug test? Do they not? Can I get away with it? Are they friendly toward the drug user? And so that's something that you don't want to communicate out in the community in which you live by just being silent on the issue. Bottom line is, drug testing programs absolutely do work. Workers who are not in a drug testing program have substance use rates that are 50% higher than those that are. We've seen this work successfully in U.S. Department of Transportation and the military program. But these days, that drug test is not enough. Now, we are finding that all supervisors must be trained to detect and document the signs and symptoms of substance use in every employee, and to conduct tests under reasonable suspicion when they feel like there is cause that an employee may be operating under the influence. That is a great expense to an employer for that professional training. So aside from the costs I've already mentioned, this is another burden that we're seeing. They must assess the specific contemporaneous articulable observations concerning appearances, behavior, speech, and body odors of the employee. And it's something that, is showing up in court cases as employees try to sue for their right to continue working while using legal cannabis. We do not yet have an impairment test for this drug. We will not for many years to come. The drug is highly unstable. It's becoming more potent instead of being standardized at a lower potency rate. And so for people to think, well, we will just wait until there's an impairment test and then everything will be okay and it'll be just like alcohol. It doesn't work the same as alcohol. It can't be tested the same way as alcohol. So we're looking at least a decade, if not more, before we have a reliable impairment test. Employers must plan and prepare and work on prevention for incidents of workplace violence. They must actively engage in a progressive safety program. They must address mental health in the workplace as well as a drug-free workplace environment, and never ever turn a blind eye to the potential of those who could develop substance use disorders. We are in an era where employers now must consider who may be under the influence at work. And while that might sound quite silly to you, that is what the cannabis industry is supporting. They are saying you should have some employees who may be able to be under the influence at work, and then those who are safety sensitive and cannot. That is actually where we are in this era. And while you might find that ridiculous, that's the path that we're going down when we legalize cannabis. So therefore, make sure that every position description in your employee defines who is safety sensitive and who is not, and articulate why each position description should or may not operate under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And finally, I just want to say, I've run through this material very quickly. I've had a lot to pour in here into a very short time, and I understand that, and I do welcome your questions. But at the end of the day, for me, this is about taking care of people and keeping them safe. And when we just kind of allow a culture to persist where drug use becomes more important than an employer's right or an employee's right to a safe and drug-free workplace, then we are not thinking of those who are vulnerable. And so I want to advocate for that. Safety should always be our greatest, highest priority. I would love to take your questions. Again, if you want to reach out to me, it is joe@joemcguire.org. And aside from that, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you, Joe, for another exceptional presentation following Jan. Delegates, please text your questions to 0491 681 630. Mark Joe Maguire for that question. We're going to move through. I do apologise for that loss of transmission there for a while. We had an internet outage for about 5 or 6 minutes. That's going to put us a little behind. I do apologise again. Technical difficulties beyond our capacity. Next presenter, our third presenter for today is Dr. Karen Randall. Again, looking forward to hearing from her. Thanks, Karen.
Hi, this is Karen Randall. I'm here from Colorado talking to you today about marijuana and the emergency department and what we're seeing here in Colorado. We legalized cannabis in approximately 2013. Today's talk will include basic information about cannabis, about concentration of cannabis and the new products that we're seeing available, and the reason why the concentration is such an issue. And we'll also be seeing and discussing medical issues related to cannabis as they present in the emergency department. Some of the very basic information that we need to know so we can understand why this is a problem here. Cannabis comes from cannabis sativa. Whether it's hemp or CBD or THC, it all comes from the plant cannabis sativa. Sativa and indica are THC-bearing plants. Recently, the THC level has been increased, and as they increase the THC level on plants, the CBD level decreases. Ruderalis is traditionally known as hemp, and here in Colorado, state law says it must contain less than 0.3% THC, although it's important to note that this can be cross-pollinated by plants very far away. So if we take a look at understanding the changes, back in the 1990s and earlier, a typical joint contained about 1 to 3 milligrams of THC. And most of the time when people smoked a joint at that time or earlier, they shared the joint, so they were really getting less than 1 to 3 milligrams of THC. Currently, after legalization, we've changed how the product is presented and used. We now see that it's a smoked product, it's contained in edibles, it's contained in concentrates, and we'll talk about those in a second. And we also see products that are suppositories, injectables, tampons, transdermals, patches, creams, lotions, etc. This is what we call dab wax or shatter, and this is the most concerning part about the cannabis that we have currently in Colorado. Dab wax and shatter is made from a concentrate, and we take the plant itself. It's extracted with using butane or propane, and there's a liquid or a resin that comes out of the extraction process, and it's made either dab wax or shatter, and this is what you see on your screen here. If you look at the bottom left, it's called New York City Diesel. It's wax, and it is 62.3% THC. So if you have 100 grams, or if you have a gram, which is 1,000 milligrams, you have 623 milligrams of THC. It's called wax because the final product resembles earwax. Shatter, the final product resembles glass, and the same with dab. Dab is a little bit less, somewhere in between wax and shatter. Here's some of the available products that we have currently in Colorado. We have medicated lip balm, so you can see why this would be a problem with kids in school. If they take the patch off, you wouldn't know if this was chapstick or if it was THC chapstick. You have THC condoms, topical creams. We have down here in the bottom left, you have THC infused toothpaste. One of the potential real problems is tinctures of THC. So in this little bottle in the middle, on the bottom, the high THC cannabis extract, 420 milligrams of THC in the bottle, but it's based on dropper doses, and people tend to way overuse this, which presents a problem. Next to that, we have the cannabis iced tea, we have cannabis tampons, we have desserts, candies, fruits, edibles, and we have THC infused toothpicks. Medical issues, I'll talk about a local community study. We'll talk about cannabinoid-induced hyperemesis, acute psychosis, vaping, and pulmonary injuries that we're seeing. And we'll also talk about what kind of impact we're seeing on youth and children, especially here in our community, knowing that we have 7.5 years of use here. This is my study. We record all the urine drug screens done in the emergency department since 2013. So we have approximately 8 or 9 months pre-legalization, because 2013 was the year it was passed, but it was not open for retail stores until 2014. If you look at the top line, you can see that this is recordings of all the urine drug screens done in our emergency department since that time. So we have, I think, about 40,000 tests, individual tests. And over the years, you'll see in 2013 on the top line, cannabis immediately started going up and has gone up continuously since legalization in 2013. That's the top purple line. The bottom or the middle blue line is opioids. And you can see where initially there was a mild drop in the use of opioids. However, since legalization in 2014, the use of opioids, or at least the positive tests in our emergency department, has gone up for the first 3 years, and then over the last 2 years it's gone down. But there's been a community effort to decrease the number of prescription opioids, and people here are transitioning from opioids to fentanyl, and fentanyl doesn't show up on our drug screens. The third line, and the most concerning line, is amphetamines, and we can see a marked increase, in fact over a 250% increase in the use of amphetamines locally in our community. And the final line, the red line on the bottom, is cocaine. And our community, the use of cocaine has not really changed over this last several years. What this means for us is that legalization of cannabis in Colorado did not improve illicit drugs in the community. In fact, it seemed to give rise to a liberalization and usage of more drugs than ever in our communities. We're finding that in particular, amphetamine has become very prevalent among our patients. And when we see them in the emergency department, the combination of amphetamine and THC use seems to be pretty predominant. This is a sound here, is the sound of hyperemesis. And I want you to listen to a couple more of this. So that's commonly what we call vomiting. This is hyperemesis or scream vomiting. And this was a very small, less than 100-pound girl who was making that vomiting, and the recording was done outside the room. I can tell who's got cannabinoid-induced hyperemesis from across the room, and we see it with both THC and CBD. Some people believe that you can't see it with CBD, but it has been seen with CBD. It's most likely to develop in people who are chronic users of cannabis. And the symptoms, the primary symptom is loud vomiting, which you heard, and then repeated and persistent bouts of vomiting, which is cyclic. The cost of the hyperemesis is for RED, a visit, who includes IV fluids, medications, CT scans, plain films, costs about $5,000 to $6,000 US. Our emergency department has seen at least one visit a day, and our hospital cost for over a year will be $1.8 million, and this is estimated on the low side. And now we know that there's 25 additional EDs in Colorado. A recent study by Zimmer et al. Shows that the average cost to diagnose cannabinoid-induced hyperemesis, or CHS, is about $76,000, and this includes CT scans, testing, endoscopy, but does not include hospitalization. The recent article that I reviewed showed that there's an increasing number of pediatric cases that we've been seeing, and most predominantly, and interesting enough, it seems like the younger pediatric patients are female. We are also seeing acute psychosis, and the acute psychosis is on the lines where I have never seen this significant before. We know that the impact of cannabis use and the development of psychotic disorders is very predominant. And a study done by Wilkinson et al. Showed that there are 3 distinct relationships. You have acute psychosis associated with acute intoxication, acute psychosis that goes beyond the period of acute intoxication, and you also have persistent psychosis, which is not time limited. So this means it can present at any point, whether you're using cannabis or not. And we know through this study that they can actually induce all the symptoms of schizophrenia or psychosis in a person who is normal by injecting them or giving them high dose cannabis. And at that time, 5 milligrams was thought to be high dose. Acute intoxication and psychosis in the emergency department, it's now being seen very frequently. My oldest patient was a 72-year-old female who was visiting from the East Coast. She ingested edible THC and presented acutely psychotic to the emergency department, requiring sedation and prolonged observation. The youngest one I saw was 2 weeks ago, was a 12-year-old who got through social media 500 milligram THC candy, and then she shared it with a friend. So each one of the little girls ingested 250 milligrams of THC. Mind you that the old joints contained 1 to 3 milligrams. So this meant that we had to do a prolonged observation in the emergency department and support vital signs while these children were here. The problem is the kids have figured out how to get this through social media such as Snapchat. If we move along to vaping injuries, it was a big issue just before COVID presented, and this is a significant lung damage. It's thought to be due to the inhalation of the propane, butane, or other products in THC. Most of the cases, according to the CDC, of vaping injuries were secondary to THC. This was over 80% of the cases. Some of the cases of lung injury or vaping injury were so severe that it required lung transplant. And on the top x-ray, you can see on the left is a chest x-ray that has some black in it. We like to see a lot of black. And on the right, you can see where there's almost white out. And that means that really none of the lungs are working. Several of these patients have required lung transplantation. So the cost of one transplanted lung patient is probably over $1 million, not to mention loss of potential financial abilities and able to self-support. So it's a long-term money loss and a significant cost to society. And these are associated with vaping, mostly dab, wax, and shatter. Cases are still occurring, although COVID has taken over media attention at this point. Some of the youth issues that we're seeing recently, there was a Colorado Healthy Kids survey, and it showed that children in our area are using more, and they're using at a younger age. Kids are starting their cannabis career with the higher potency products for many reasons. And several of the reasons are that there's less odor associated with it, so it's easier to use in a vape pen or a dab pen. You can basically take a hit discreetly every now and then from your pen at school. There are numerous ways to hide these. There is a vape hoodie that has a string that looks like a tie for a jacket, and it's actually a vape pen. Sadly, what we're seeing is that in our school district locally, in 2018, we have a 38% chronic absenteeism rate in kids going to the school. So if you can imagine over 1/3 of your kids chronically missing school, there has to be a reason. Looking at disciplinary actions. So what's happening to our youth in school? This is done from schools looking at 2016 to 2018. The blue is suspensions based on drug violations other than marijuana, and the orange is drug violations with involving marijuana only. And you can see in 2016 and 2017, there are far more cases of issues involved with marijuana than all the other drugs combined. So the company and one of the the marijuana organizations have said it will be legalized. We'll make sure our kids don't get it. It'll decrease the illegal market. Our kids won't get it, and everything will be better. But what we've seen here in Colorado is our illegal market has taken off. Like I said, kids are getting it from Snapchat and other social media. And this is a report of the student marijuana source from 2017, and it was from the Association of School Resource Officers. And what they did was find out where these kids were getting their marijuana. 39% of them, so the bar on the far right, 39% got it from a friend who got it legally, and 26% got it from a black market. So you can see, and then an additional 23% got it from their parents, so also would be a person who would presumably obtained it legally. So you can see a good portion of our kids are getting it from people who got it legally or from the black market. So it has not stopped kids from being able to access cannabis and all the products associated with it. Before we leave, I think I would be remiss in not showing you some of the decorative scenes of our communities since legalization. I think we've seen it in all the cities here in Colorado, the big cities, and our city in particular, Denver as well as Portland and Seattle, where the number of homeless has just gone up tremendously. And I think this is accumulation of many factors. But one of the big factors playing into this is the prevalence of drugs. And it seems to me clinically working here that the drug adventure starts with marijuana, and they are starting with high dose, high concentrate marijuana, and then expanding, looking for the better high or the bigger high. What we're seeing is the whole vast majority of homeless people. In the middle, you can see plants that were taken from an illegal grow, and this was in the middle of a very nice neighborhood. And the bottom picture on the right-hand side is a picture of my brother's neighbor. My brother lives north of Denver. He's actually a firefighter, and he was at work, and he got a message that his neighbor's house was on fire. It turns out that his neighbor's house was an illegal grow. And once you have it, if you have an illegal grow, you board up the windows in the basement. So basically, firefighters have to fight the fire from without and let the structure collapse, because if they go in, there's no egress through the basement windows because they're all boarded up. So that's my brother's neighbor, and he'd like to think he lives in an okay neighborhood. So these are all side effects of having legalization. We're promised a lot of taxes and a lot of tax revenue, but just looking at the costs, again, one emergency department in Colorado with one ER visit a day for cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome exceeds $1.8 million of cost. And so that cost is given to Medicaid or Medicare or insurance companies, which are paid for by the general public. The taxes go to, in Colorado, every state is different, the taxes go to discretionary funding, so they don't necessarily get turned back to the public. So we're really cost shifting all the societal costs of cannabis, but a few people are benefiting from the taxes, and it doesn't seem to be like the public at large, and specifically the single person who's paying more for taxes to support the medical as well as the police and community harms reduction. And at this time, I'd like to see if you have any questions. You can contact me or ask me right now, or you can always get a hold of me through Shane. Thank you. Bye.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Randall. Great work, and Dr. Randall was with us earlier in the year on her National Cannabis Conundrum Tour. Again, please text your questions to 0491 681 630. Again, a lot of data here in a very short amount of time, and I do apologise, we are behind time. Our final presenter today, and importantly, is Professor John Toombaroo. We will launch his presentation, Permissive Norms and Laws and Longitudinal Harm to Youth. Thank you, John.
Laws related to long-term for cannabis use. I'm called the Centre for Social and Emotional Development, and within our research grouping, we have research theme examines longitudinal research. So you can see our organised to explore different questions that are important. So we're looking to try and encourage healthy development. We're trying to explore through the longitudinal studies, look at what works and what translates. We'll be really focusing very much on what we can from longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies can tell us legalizing cannabis, and that'll be pursuing today. When we look at the issues with cannabis legalization, we often hear arguments, and commonly you can see a sequence of these arguments that have occurred in many of the places where cannabis has legalized. Typically, cannabis is initially promoted as a medicinal product, a solution to rare and understudied conditions. And then proponents argue, well, it has benefits there, so why not permit recreational use as the next line of argument. Proponents of this argue that legalisation will reduce the harms and the tax returns will outweigh the harms. So these are a fairly important set of claims. Existing longitudinal evidence clearly shows cannabis use to be harmful in the long term. I was part of a consortia that you can see related to a number of the authors that are published in this particular paper. And this is a paper that was published in 2014 in Lancet Psychiatry that was exploring across a range of the largest longitudinal studies in Australia and New Zealand what happens in young adulthood when young people are using cannabis in adolescence. That paper showed that there was consistent evidence that adolescent cannabis use predicted harmful outcomes of cannabis dependence, increased risk of illicit drug use, of having welfare use, and mental health problems. So there was interesting kickback when we published this paper. Many people, yes, that's the case in countries where cannabis use is illegal, but this will all change once cannabis use is legal. Existing literature as it presently stands predict harmful consequences of cannabis legalization. I'll explore it a little bit further why I say that. One of the studies that you can look at is this study by Fisher and colleagues published in 2020 this year. And in this study, you can see that where they look at the different countries and states that have legalized, what they show is that there is tendency towards increased use of cannabis in adulthood. That's not, the jury's out on that one. They do a consistent pattern that the price, therefore the ability of cannabis becomes increased because of the falling. Also, there's more use of higher potency forms of cannabis. The other trend that's consistently being shown is cannabis-related disorders have an increased prevalence. There's also a trend for more cannabis use on roads. So these are the findings that we have. Most people caveat by saying it's still early days, but at the moment, papers that Fisher and colleagues have cited that we've been conducting, that's a cross-national consequence cannabis legalisation in early adulthood affect cannabis in adults, because we know that this evidence in adults. The study is called the International Youth Development between institutions. Here the logos for the Social Washington, my own university at Deakin, and also the CERT that have all been collaborators. The study is particularly what's happening in Australia and the United States, particularly focusing on the comparison of the states of Victoria and Washington State, which is up here in the northwest of the United States. So these two states were picked because they had a number of similarities. We aim to compare the rates of health and behaviour outcome states, particularly focusing on the development of substance use, of what happens there, and how it relates to social behaviour and mental health as young people grow, and also computer influence the third is the difference between the Washington State, where there was a focus collection was initiated with a large grant from other agencies. The sample representative of students 2002, exactly the use to and Washington. We ambitious study. There were roughly 4,000 in the eligible. We were managed to recruit 3,000, almost 3,000. You can see equal numbers. The participation rate just falling under %. The retention rate has been excellent up until the 3 years. 98% were retained in the sample, and here you can see at the age 25 follow-up, 87% retention into the age 29 follow-up. That was completed actually in 2019. We had an 80% retention rate. So these are excellent retention rates. Our intention is to keep following this. That we have when the average age was 13, 14, 15 through the first samples in Washington State and Victoria, and their average age 25. And at that point, recreational collection. So the samples were completely matched for all characteristics that we thought were relevant, and the samples being followed slightly later to account for seasonal variation. So the IODS was this, we started to survey in 2018. This was from age 25 through to 29. New uptake of use in Washington State compared to Victoria. So this is a finding consistent. We're talking about a little earlier in a review study that showed a tendency towards higher rates of adult use with cannabis legal. This finding would be consistent with that states that we examined. Look at the percentage. We see the percent of population that was still in this of use in into the late 20s. This pattern of continued use was predicted by risk factors that are associated with cannabis legalisation. So in the study, we were able to ask young people about the availability of legal cannabis. So this was living near shops, purchasing cannabis legally, but also having it available in recreational settings, including sports clubs and social environments. And we looked at here we have a multiple regression adjusting for a number of covariates you can see listed here, and was examining the effect that availability had on age 29 use. You can see that it's a significant effect in Washington, but legal availability obviously has very little effect, scored 0. There was some availability in the sports setting and social environments, but much lower than in Washington state. Availability increased in Washington state from 25 through to 29. Prevalence refers to the perceived social use of cannabis in different settings, and here we've explored use again in social recreational settings, but also in your family of origin, in intimate partners and in friends and work colleagues, and we look at the prevalence here. Here we see that prevalence, once you adjust for availability and acceptability, still has a significant effect in Washington state, but it's a larger effect in Victoria. So the model is showing that these things are predictive both in the environment where these things are legal and not legal, but prevalence, the perceived prevalence increased from age 25 to 29 in Washington state. Acceptability, the view that people in those various environments, that social environments that young people within, that they believe that it would be acceptable to use cannabis. You can see these things have an equal effect in Washington state and Victoria. However, the perceived acceptability increased substantially from age 25 to 29 during through the legalisation period in Washington state. So the risk factors have a similar long-term effect, but are larger in the legalisation environment. So there's more use after cannabis legalisation. And unfortunately, when we now look at the long-term effects of use, we find that there is actually still substantial harm associated with cannabis use. Here we next compare the environments of prediction in Victoria, Washington state, and in the combined sample. What we're looking at here is what is the effect of cannabis use in 2014, so at age 25, on consequences measured in 2018 at age 29. We compare the two samples, Victoria and Washington. Again, we have a number of covariates we're adjusting for, and we want to just look at the standardized coefficient of prediction. The standard errors are also listed here. And you can see that your use of cannabis in 2014, 4 years later, is a predictor of increased use in 29, or increased or stable use. You can see overall that it's contributing to higher rates of use. In fact, this effect is exactly the same in the different states. So non-significant means there's no state difference. Here we have an index of cannabis problems, the next thing we looked at in our analyses. And these were social problems, mental health symptoms or injury. And we had 8 items that we measured and we averaged here. Here we find that cannabis-related problems are actually significantly affecting being predicted by cannabis use in both Victoria and Washington state and in the combined sample. The effect is actually stronger in Victoria, so it could be argued that the increased use of cannabis in Washington state was actually including a number of people who perhaps did not use it problematically, although the overall increase in use was still associated with problems. In Victoria, where you tended to use even though there's slightly less rates of use, you're more likely to have problems in this environment. One of the worries that we have about cannabis use is the potential for it to lead to other forms of drug use. And here we see significant effects in both states, and they're very similar effects where your use of cannabis is predicting that you will be using cigarettes to a higher degree. So it's a risk factor for cigarette use in adulthood. Similarly, for opioid use, that you can see there's a similar effect in both states. Here we look at driving whilst using marijuana. Again, if you are using at age 25, there's an increased risk that you'll be driving using marijuana when you're age 29. The effect is actually higher in Washington state, consistent with the earlier review that I referred to that shows this is one of the implications that happens under legalisation is there's more driving whilst using the substances. Depressive symptoms, here we actually find there's no state differences. The effect was not significant. There was low rates of the association in Victoria, but the overall combined results were such that we couldn't see an interaction effect. And in Washington state, it's a significant effect that if you're using in 2014, you're more likely to have depressive symptoms by age 29. Suicidal thoughts, again, similar predictive effect in both states. Cannabis use at age 25 in 2014, 4 years later, predicted higher rates of suicidal thoughts. For self-harm, again, we did see actually a slightly higher rate of predictive effects of self-harm in Victoria than Washington state, and this effect is significantly different in the two states. And perhaps again suggesting that there are some users that are picking up in Washington that don't have necessarily problems. Sleep problems, here we find that there were a tendency to sleep problems in Victoria that we couldn't see associated with this in the Washington sample or in the combined sample. Now, in this next set of overheads, I'm looking at a number of other types of problems that may be associated with cannabis use. We didn't pick up any predictive effect on relationship conflict or partner violence. There did seem to be effects on homelessness, and again, we couldn't see any difference between the effects. So cannabis use at age 25 predicted higher rates of homelessness at 29. For injuries and health, no effects, and we couldn't see those in either state. However, in the areas of financial difficulty and problems with income, these were things that we picked up significant effects in Washington state and in the combined sample, but we couldn't pick them up in Victoria. But when we looked for interactions, they weren't significantly different. So overall, what we're finding is that financial and income problems seem to be associated longitudinally with cannabis use. Unemployment or your entry into skilled work, again, we couldn't find effects for those. However, in the legal areas, there's some interesting findings. It's often said that one of the reasons for bringing in legalisation is to reduce problems associated with crime. However, here we see that incarceration rates are actually quite predicted by your cannabis use, so that you're more likely to report incarceration in 2018 at age 29, in the case where you were using cannabis at age 25. And we see that this effect is actually significantly higher in Washington state. So that is, again, suggesting that you perhaps don't take away completely the association between cannabis use and crime, even though you've got higher rates of the use and it's recreationally legally available. For court offences, again, we had no differences in the rates of turning up to court. The effect was fairly small in Washington state, so that we didn't see it being significant effect. It is a significant predictor in the combined sample, but when we look for interactions, we don't see state differences highlighted as significant. So quite a lot of interesting findings. In summary, what the IOADS confirms is, consistent with prior studies, is that cannabis legalisation is associated with increased risk factors of availability, perceived prevalence and acceptability. These are, we would argue, some of the reasons why the cannabis legalisation is associated with increased adult use. So this is increased frequency of use. Other studies are showing increased use in potency. Unfortunately, this increased use there's no evidence at this stage that you're protected from long-term harms. We don't see that. We do see that there's some users that are using perhaps at moderate levels, but overall, the increased use we see from the review studies that have been done at the moment is associated with increased hospitalisation and cannabis problems. So overall, the study here suggests that long-term harms overall are similar, even in the environment where it's legal. So the conclusions you can see from our study are fairly consistent with those that have been reported in previous studies. And so I look forward to further follow-ups of our own research and the ability to further interrogate the findings we have. But at the moment, they certainly do suggest a number of cautions associated with cannabis legalisation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Soombaru, for again. So I love the analysis in play there. Delegates, again, you can text your questions to John or any of the other presenters at 0491 681 630. We do apologise for going over time. Again, the difficulties with technology has been party to that end. Just wondering if we're still alive. Yep. We at this point in time, we do want to officially thank all of our presenters. They're coming on live now. For those who have to go, again, I apologise for the 15-minute overplay on this space. To let you know that all presentations in their complete presentations, will be available on our website in the next week or so for you to access on our YouTube channel as well. So that data will be there. Also, PowerPoints for the presentations will be available. But most importantly, we do encourage you to continue to engage with and contact our presenters and their resources, because this is obviously not static data. This is dynamic and continuing to move. So when it comes to, now we've got some questions moving forward. Again, before we do that, just want to officially, again, express our sincere appreciation and thanks and gratitude to all of our remarkable, high-quality presenters. You won't find a lineup like this in many places in the world, and we do thank them for their contribution today. And it is, again, spectacular, quite spectacular. I don't know the words. So just wanting to ensure if we're live or not. Okay, the follow-up will be on our webinars. Just not sure if we're still live. Are we live? Yeah, my apologies. So anyway, our presenters are now available on screen. And you can see, just before we go to them for the questions, the follow-up webinar resources will be available at this particular address as well. And again, I'm sorry for the issues around technology. It's creating a few little hiccups for us here. We do apologise. Okay, questions. Bear with me. So, yeah, just need to have the questions put up into the chat there, if we could, please, Paul, if possible. Okay. A lot of issues being discussed are probably best addressed by effective harm reduction campaigns. Do the speakers support harm reduction campaigns? I mean, that's a generic question for panel. Anyone specifically want to address that?
I might begin, if that's all right, Shane.
Yeah, certainly, Professor John, go.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yes. I mean, in Australia, we've got a sort of proud record of harm minimisation, harm reduction campaigns. But I guess that one of the main messages here is that prevention is obviously should always be the first step that you take. And if we're seeing increased rates of use and we're seeing that this use is associated with increased harm, then it does seem that there's a fundamental problem with legalisation. It's actually creating risk factors that are going to make the harms more widespread. So I guess that from my presentation of what I'm seeing in the data that I presented from the International Youth Development Studies, it does seem to me that there is no evidence that I can see that the forms of legalisation that are being studied so far in the various state and national experiments are doing anything other than increasing the amounts of use. And it would seem very obvious that you're going to have quite extensive harms. That being the case, I think that it becomes difficult to imagine the scale of the effort that you're going to need to remedy that level of harm. So I think that would be a very costly exercise, and it just seems to me that, again, I just repeat that mostly we know that prevention is a much more efficient way forward, and prevention in this case actually would suggest that you've got to sort of stop the widespread public health issues that come where you have increased use that's harmful. So that's where I'm sitting at the moment on the issue.
Sure.
And if I could just add another little bit to that. So what we've seen here in Colorado is that what happened when we legalized is that there was normalization of use. So we actually have been limited by a lot of people with regards to harm reduction. So kids are seeing it be normalized use with their parents, their adults in their lives, and they're following suit. So harm reduction would have to be doubly intensified because we've normalized this. It is far cheaper to prevent than it is to treat a problem. And additionally, what we found is that, or what we're seeing here in my community, is that even though we have tried harm reduction, use is going up, harms are going up. And despite that, we've had to close our treatment programs because we don't have enough funding. So I'm not a fan of harm reduction. I don't think that you can liberalize and encourage the use of drugs, which you would have to do to make taxes, and then call harm reduction.
Anybody else want to chime in on that one before we go to our next question?
I'd just like to comment and agree in terms that with policy changes like legalization, there's no amount of harm reduction interventions that can address the great increase in risks of initiation and increased use, as my colleagues here have mentioned. But nonetheless, I think, in Australia, we had some level of harm reduction, which when legalization of medicinal came in was completely abandoned rather than accelerated. It seems that governments can only do one thing at a time. And I think a more sophisticated approach of including in the spectrum of harm reduction, very strong emphasis on prevention and delay of initiation. But for those who are going to use, and I think prohibition may be desirable, but it's not very realistic, we should also have targeted intervention programs to prevent accelerated use of dependence, safer ways of use, such as not using more than once a week, etc. Some kind of evidence-based messaging to the community and to users in a way that they're going to find palatable and useful, I think should be included in our overall approach to reducing cannabis-related harm.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to make a statement additionally, we need to be very clear that this is not just simply a campaign to legalize or decriminalize. What we've seen in the US and in Canada is a massive commercialization. So this is about driving profit, and it's 100% about driving. So when you legalize any product for profit, then the goal is commercialization so that you increase use, get more profit. So when you talk about harm reduction, that's completely antithetical to what is happening with cannabis. So if you want a true, decriminalization or a true legalization that reduces harm and discourages increased use and that type of thing, then it would be the opposite of the commercialization that we're seeing, and would come with severe limits on THC potencies. It would come with limits on marketing and broad commercialization. Here in the U.S., you're not supposed to be able to market an illicit drug, and yet there's billboards and newspaper articles and magazines, and it's all over the internet. And so you really are, what we're creating is a false paradigm. We're trying to put this really nice spin on it, like we're just going to legalize and decriminalize, but that's not really what's happening. So the realistic conversation is, how do you prevent mass commercialization for those who are posturing to make big money? Make sure the conversation is honest and legitimate, and then you'll have a better discussion.
Thanks,
I agree. And fortunately here in Australia, commercialisation of cannabis, whilst the proponents of it have been pushing a lot of these policy changes in the hope of changing our culture, but I agree what's happened in the US with commercialisation and in Canada and other places, it's, incompatible with prevention and harm reduction. But there's some hope in Australia because we've seen decriminalisation work without commercialisation. And I think we should sell that message that we have a workable model in many of our states. And a lot of this discussion here is just not, it's un-Australian. What can I say? Commercialisation of drugs is not on.
Sure. Okay, thank you, panel, for that. Brilliant. Second question, sort of similar, and interestingly, it's a bit of a loaded one. The failures in rolling out appropriate public health measures in legalisation can be learned from. Well, I think our opening excerpt from that town hall demonstrated that this has been in play for 8 years and nothing's been learned. In fact, everything's accelerated. But the question says, I suppose my question is, how does prohibition better address these issues than open public health campaigns funded by a legal industry? So I'll open that up. Again, public health. Anyone want to buy into that one?
I think I will just chime in first, and then let the probably better experts comment on after. I really believe that prohibition is a hotbed word. It's rhetoric, because discouraging drug use and coming at any type of drug use from a preventive point of view has become associated with the dirty word of prohibition, and then pointing back to the prohibition in the earlier part of the last century as, look how much harm this caused. But we know that prevention works. Prevention that has been implemented for decades has had wonderful successes. So again, I think it's another one of those red herring conversations to try to throw people off and take the conversation down a different path rather than solving this issue and finding a better model or having a better conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Anybody else?
Look, I'll add to that by saying that I do think that at the moment what we're studying is what we have available. So we're really studying the experiments that have occurred at the moment in looking at the way that legalisation and decriminalisation are working in practice. And so I think that the first thing to say is that However, you might envisage a model that might have sufficient learning in it that it could actually learn from what's happened to date. I think what we have to admit at the moment, and I think that what we're seeing in the presentations we're hearing today is that the way that legalisation is occurring at the moment is not fulfilling many of the promises that proponents of legalisation have put to us, that we would be able to contain problems such as the increased acceptability, the perceived prevalence, the reduction in price, the increase of potency. All of these things, I think, when we were initially looking at arguments that proponents were putting to us, that they were suggesting that these wouldn't occur, that they could be contained in some way. So the first thing to say is legalisation has not contained these things. We're seeing increased use, we're seeing increased harms. So I think that to put the idea that there may be some other model that's available to us by which we could contain these harms, I think I'd like to see what that might be. But at the moment, I think that today's presentations sound a loud warning that we had a vote recently, just narrowly missed in New Zealand, that the populace there decided not to go down the road of legalising recreational use. Now, New Zealand's a very sensible country and it's a bit more like Australia, and I guess that there might have been efforts there to try to reduce the problems we're seeing with legalisation that have occurred to date. So how are we going to, with these new models, contain the price drops that occur and the increases in potency that we're seeing? I'm not seeing anything on the table that suggests to me that can be contained. How do you contain the problem of increased perception that it's socially acceptable and that it's prevalent in different groups that drives your tendency to again, these are the basis of changed social norms. So there's just nothing in my mind I can see by way that you would be able to, I don't see any proposal to reduce those things that drive increased use. And at the moment, we're not seeing any evidence that this use is made safe by somehow the changes in legalisation.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Any more questions coming to the fore, Paul? No, there's not at this stage. Before we sign off and finalise today, we've gone a little bit over. I do apologise again. Technical difficulties has created some of that issue. I want to say thank you again to all our presenters. And I think the public health issue remains the single greatest driver of policy management in this space. And I think that what we're seeing and what we've heard today, just in short, and these presentations are only a snapshot, ladies and gentlemen, of bigger resources and larger studies and evidence. And I encourage you to, again, engage with our presenters and their specific websites, their studies. These people aren't out to bang a particular drum. They're not prohibitionists, they're not abstentionists. They are people concerned with public health and good evidence-based science, which the industry, the cannabis industry, has little interest in because it's about profits and drivers. There is a statement that has been said to me many, many times, and I don't disagree with it. That is, you cannot arrest your way out of the drug problem. Concur, I concur. But you certainly will not treat your way out of this problem either. In fact, you'll create an even bigger hole. And the concerns that we have is that the current laws are not being tasked effectively to actually bring about what should be happening, is a leading away from drug use, not a punitive response, not a incarceration, not a legislative response that creates criminal records and all things. But more importantly, it enables people to delay uptake, deny uptake, but more importantly, to be the citizens they can be with drug-free. So there's another question just popping up now before we go. What is it? Ask a question for Karen, directed to Karen. What is it, Paul? Still coming. It's interesting. The drug that does the single drug that does the greatest harm in our community is still the legal one of alcohol. And the concern we always have is, why would you add another drug to that regimen? Because legality.
I think the question. Sorry, I think the question is: is there evidence of progression of cannabis use to other drugs? Look, if I can just chime in initially on that to say in my presentation, what I was showing is that where we did the longitudinal follow-up, we were seeing that cannabis use adult cannabis use in the legal context was actually predicting firstly, the first thing we see is increased persistence and further uptake of cannabis later on as being more common in the legal environment. But we do see that it's a predictor of maintaining or increasing tobacco use, but also use of opioids. So those things are coming through in the data that I was analysing in our cross-national longitudinal study.
Certainly, Karen, you want to chime in on that one?
And I mean, we've been accused numerous times of being prohibitionists per se. And I think what we're all trying to say is that there are public harms that we can see and that are occurring, but not only occurring, but occurring with momentum. So we know that our youth are using more than recent Healthy Kids studies show that youth are using more than 20 to 30% more than they were 2 years ago. And so we can see that there are more public health harms, there are more harms in the workplace. And before you legalize, you have to understand, you can't just prohibit because it's already there. So you could decriminalize what you have, but to legalize is what Joe said, you're commercializing. And the problem here that we have is not only was it commercialized, we're talking about this incredible potency that is so harmful for the public. And it's not, looking at it from a health perspective, it's not beneficial. We're seeing hyperemesis. We see that daily in our emergency department, and there's a huge cost to care for these people. And that cost of care is being funneled back to the individual taxpayer, and it'll happen to you guys too. And it's the psychosis, and the psychosis is exceptionally frightening and exceptionally concerning because it can happen anytime. There are early studies out that show not only can you have psychosis in the user, but there may be a related link, and I can give the information to Shane, that there may be a related link to having emotional behavioral problems in off of users, and we're seeing that as well. And so all these costs are being generalized back. So it's not that we want to prohibit everything, it's that we have to bring up, I feel it's my duty as a physician that I see and I treat these people every day. It's my duty to tell you, here's the harms. I'm not a policymaker. Before this all happened, the federal government set forth a Cole memorandum. I suggest you look it up. It has outlined the principles that they said, if these things happen, the federal government will shut it down. One of the 8 points was that youth using more. Well, we know our youth are using more. Not only they're using more, they're using high potency. Didn't shut it down. That it won't be, that the federal government or federal land won't be used. We know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of illegal grows right here in Colorado on federal lands. And we know that the illegal market has blossomed. So if we will look at the principles set forth, we're not even enforcing what we have, and the same will happen to you. So it isn't prohibition. You have to take a realistic look at what happens to your people and what happens to your population when you liberalize the amount of drugs being used, and not only liberalize, but you have industrialized the strength. And that, I guarantee you, is when they start in high school or junior high school, they will look for a bigger and better high. And if you look at my study where we're looking at urine drug screens that are done in the community, you can see that most drugs are going up. So the usage of not just cannabis, but other drugs in the environment are going up. And we're seeing kids in high school. We're seeing kids in junior high school using these drugs now. And so it isn't prohibition that we're saying, no, it is the fact that the harms are monument. And there's no way to overcome these harms. You will have an illegal market, you will have youth usage, and you will have increased medical harms.
Brilliant. Team, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much. Delegates, thank you for your patience with us today. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for the questions that have been asked. Again, I encourage you all to visit our website, and all these presentations will be online, but more importantly, the details of all presenters will be there, so you can contact them and continue your investigations, get the evidence that you need to make informed decisions, particularly for public health and the well-being of our families and communities. On that note, we will close this webinar and Q&A, and thank you again for being part of this important event.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
You know,